subsidies. That's
actually stupid. It's not even.
okay. So, you know, ethanol subsidies, and well-meaning, but there are people in this room that briefed the then finance minister and said, when the finance minister asked, should we be introducing subsidies to corn? And this was a broad base of economists and ecologists who all said no. Well, we know what happened, and that was the price of corn went up. The poor people had to pay more for the corn in the countries that were necessities. So getting things right means doing policy that takes into account these things. And I still believe that we can do them both. But we can't do it on, I agree, we can't do it on the backs of the poor. In California, when they raised electricity prices during the crisis they had in California, which was a result of stupid policy, prices spiked. Meanwhile, British Columbia made billions of dollars, which we then had to pay back in legal costs, but never mind. Consumption dropped radically. It dropped radically.
Nancy Ohlweiler teaches public policy at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Nancy's originally from Ohio, where in 1969, something happened to convince her that economic philosophizing is worthless unless it puts the environment front and center.
I'd grown up in a lovely little area, but Cleveland at the time was not a lovely place. Very industrial, pollution was rampant. And on this particular event, it was sometime in June, I don't remember the exact date, the radio said something about the Cuyahoga River, which is the major river running through Cleveland, was on fire. And, you know, that's kind of a breathtaking image to think of a river on fire. So some friends and I said, well, let's go down and see this. And we got in a car and drove to where we thought the fire was. It was too late. It was already out. When I stepped out of the car, it was just a cesspool. You could smell oil. I mean, the fire was out, but you could smell oil. The banks of the river are disgusting. There's effluent pipes flowing in, and the water doesn't look like a river that you'd ever, you know, if you fell into it, you would want to be detoxified. It was oily, it was dirty, there is garbage in the river. It was disgusting. And that was part of the impetus to the change in U.S. policy to bring in the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, which were regulations to start dealing with the pollution that had henceforth been free to distribute. So that image, I just can't tell you how indelible it is. When I picture that moment, I realize that we can't go on that way. The river, to me, symbolized all that was wrong with the economic system at the time. For heaven's sakes, if a river can catch on fire, we're doomed.
By this point, the panel discussion was tending to turn back on itself. Growth will hurt the environment, or growth has to be in lockstep with environmental values. It was then that Avram Lazar, who was the public face for the forestry industry when it was being vilified, spoke up with his own way of looking at things.
It's a policy riddle, not a religious argument. And what we have to do is secularize this. When we think of pollution as an expression of evil, and environmentalism as an expression of goodness, and we take all the results of our consumption and pour that evil into some external object called industry, what we do is we mischaracterize the problem. The problem is, how do we design policies that send the right signals? And as long as we think in semi-religious terms, we completely misconstrue it. Let me give you an example from my experience when I was in Environment Canada, and it was when we were going to do the Kyoto negotiations. My job as the policy lead for climate change was to convince the rest of the government that if we didn't address climate change quickly, that all our children would die probably next year. My counterpart part from the Department of Finance and Industry was to convince everyone that if they did anything that Avram said, the economy would stop and we probably would all have to move to South America to earn a living. I'm only